When she finished scraping away the loose earth in the moonlight, she did not expect to unearth something that would change everything about the family she had served for a decade. What lay beneath a small mound in the walled garden was not a garden ornament or a long-lost heirloom, but a secret that would crack the marble calm of a billionaire household. The discovery would pull back a curtain of lies, reveal a buried life, and force a reckoning no one in that house could escape. Maria had been the housekeeper at the Lockwood estate for 11 years, knew the ticking of its old grandfather clock and the scent that hung in the corridor after dinner. The soil under her fingernails was cold and damp, and from behind the laurel hedge, a faint, almost animal sound came that made her hands shake. How far would someone go to protect a fortune, and how long could love hide a crime before the truth surfaced? Before we continue, if this story matters to you, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The estate gate was closed, and the garden lights were dim. That silent yard is where everything started. The Lockwood mansion sat on a cusp of manicured hedges and private roadways that ended only in a tall iron gate. The fountain in the front circle whispered like a rumor, and at night the house looked like a ship of glass moored on a sea of lawn. Maria rose before dawn, padded barefoot across flagstones that had been polished by decades of servants, and set out a tray of tea for the children and prepared the drawing room for the long days of guests and board meetings. She called the younger boy Jamie because he always preferred the playground to the boardroom chatter that echoed through the house, and she had watched him learn to tie his shoes and later to ride the little bicycle with training wheels. Her routine was precise, shaped by a past that began in a small coastal town where work was scarce and pride had been battered but not broken. She had left family behind and arrived at the estate with 2 suitcases and a reference letter, and the employer who hired her, Mr. Lockwood, had been kind at first in a way that made her believe in good luck rather than fortune. Over the years, she was entrusted with more than linens. She learned when to smile and when to be invisible, how to read the edges of conversations between the adults at the dinner table, the way secrets hid in formalities. The gardener, Anthony, knew where the old bulbs were stored. The chauffeur, Raoul, took late runs to the city. The butler, Henry, kept the household ledger and the keys. The nanny, Claire, handled the children like a second mother, but with a clipboard in hand. The new fiancée, Vanessa Hale, arrived 3 months ago with a laugh that filled rooms and a necklace that refused to tarnish. That was when the house changed its rhythm, when Maria noticed rooms being rearranged and a set of private rooms locked with a different key. Small signs at first: a withdrawal and dinners, a wine glass that lingered too long near a throw pillow, and a set of late messages on Mr. Lockwood's phone. When Jamie started waking with nightmares and little injuries that were easily explained away as playground accidents, Maria began to keep a closer watch. The night Maria found the disturbed soil, she had been trimming the boxwood along the west border where the old rose bed met the wall. The moon gave the garden a pocked silver feel. The smell of wet earth rose up and made her think of childhood storms. She dug because a rusted ornament had come loose from the roots, and she expected a forgotten toy or a shard of pottery. Her fingers brushed wood, then fabric, then something that made her double back with a sound half prayer, half cry. It was a small wooden crate sealed with tape, wrapped in a blanket with a note barely legible in a hurry. The box smelled faintly of antiseptic and something cloying that reminded her of hospital rooms. Her first thought was rescue. She heard the house behind her move, a soft step where there should have been none, and then the sound again, the muffled breathing of a child. She called out, voice thin and shaking, and the sound brought someone running, the gardener with his headlamp and the night nanny Claire, both coughing at the damp air as they rushed toward the hedge. "What is it, Maria?" Anthony asked, his voice raw. "There is something in the box," Maria whispered. "I think it is a child." Claire sank to her knees and felt for a pulse that seemed too faint to be real. The blanket was clotted and cold. "Call an ambulance, call someone, please," Maria said, fingers trembling as she opened the crate and found a small body, curled like a question, eyes half closed and skin waxy. Anthony's headlamp revealed a strand of hair plastered to a pale forehead and a bruise along the temple. They lifted the child with the kind of urgent gentleness that had no time for social levels or titles. In the kitchen, the telephone lit up like an alarm. "Mr. Lockwood, wake him," Claire said. "No," Anthony muttered, "we call the emergency number first." Raoul was already backing the sedan into the drive. The air tasted of metal. The child whimpered, and a threat of a moan escaped his throat, a sound that became a rope pulling everyone into motion. "Rescue first," Maria said, and the men obeyed. The ride to the hospital was a blur of red lights and a child's labored breathing. At the emergency entrance, the nurse took the child in her arms with practiced speed, and Maria felt the world tilt. She tucked her hands into each other and counted the seconds that would decide whether a boy would live. At the hospital, the fluorescent lights buzzed like distant judgment. Machines began to speak in tones Maria had only heard from afar. A doctor with weary eyes moved like an instrument of mercy, and orders were given: scans, fluids, oxygen, sedation. The doctor said the child had signs of inhalation and possibly a sedative that explained the shallow breathing. The bruise on the temple suggested trauma. The word sedative felt like a drop of ice in her throat. Vanessa arrived later, in heels and a dress that rustled like unwanted applause, clutching a handkerchief that smelled of perfume. Her face was composed in that rehearsed way of someone who had never learned how to be small in front of disaster. "Which of you found him?" she demanded softly, and her voice had the brittle quality of someone learning lines in a play about grief. Maria could feel every eye land on her. Mr. Lockwood stood at the back of the emergency corridor, pained and white but decisive. The police station needed to be called. The pediatric team insisted on tests. As the hours passed, the child's name, Oliver, became a tether. Nurses whispered it to the monitors, and Maria repeated it under her breath like a prayer. The hospital was clinical and indifferent, while being the most humane place Maria had ever known. Doctors and a forensic expert moved through the corridors and spoke in a clinical tone that tried to apply order to chaos. The lead pediatrician, Dr. Singh, explained in compact sentences that the child had been given a depressant that slowed respiration and that the bruise required imaging to rule out a concussion. The forensic expert, Morales, asked to review the clothing and the crate and photographed the scene that Maria described in detail. "We need statements," Morales said, pen hovering over a notepad. "We will take your statements and then the evidence to the lab." In the waiting room, the family gathered, Mr. Lockwood with tears that were mostly shock, Vanessa at his side, Claire wrapped in a cardigan like someone trying to shelter from cold wind, Raoul and Anthony pale and silent, and Maria sitting rigid and, "I cannot breathe." Rumors began to circulate outside the hospital. A neighbor called the press for comment, and within hours the story smelled like sensational ink. The police station became a stage where officers started to piece timelines and establish who had access to the garden, who had keys to storage rooms, who had argued in the days before. An officer named Detective Hayes arrived with a quiet, authoritative manner and a notebook full of dates. "We will treat this as an attempted homicide until we can prove otherwise," Hayes said, his voice steady. Vanessa offered that she had not seen anything and that Jamie had been in his room, which Mr. Lockwood confirmed, though his voice wavered like a candle. Reactions in the staff room ranged from shock to whispered accusations. The household was a small society suddenly under a microscope, and gossip spread like a fever breaking out. The police took statements from everyone and noted that certain locks had been replaced recently and that a small jar of prescription sedatives was missing from the upstairs study medicine cabinet. There were fingerprints on the crate, but the soil had smudged many things, and the first forensic report would take days. After the immediate crisis, the investigation shifted from urgency to strategy. The household was sealed in a strange way, with lawyers waiting at the gates and reporters circled like vultures at the curb. Detective Hayes asked questions that felt like sieves, sifting for inconsistencies. He listened while Maria recounted how the box had not been there that morning and how she had been out trimming the rosebed at night because she couldn't sleep. "Why?" he asked. "Because I heard a sound and the roses looked wrong," she answered. Meanwhile, Vanessa began organizing the family statements and speaking privately with Mr. Lockwood, trying to shape the narrative of the household. Rumors among neighbors and staff suggested that she had been insistent about appearing calm in public. Henry, the butler, started to keep a ledger of keys and entries. Claire told the police about Jamie's recent nightmares, and Anthony revealed that he had seen Vanessa near the west hedge late one evening carrying a blanket behind her back. Raoul, who drove for the family, said he had been out making an early delivery but that his route log had a 2-hour gap he couldn't account for. Gossip turned to suspicion as Detective Hayes noticed a trail of small incongruities. The initial lab results were slow, but they revealed trace elements of a sedative compound consistent with a prescription that could have come from a bottle meant for an adult. The police station collected data, phones, and logs that showed a deleted voice memo from Mr. Lockwood's phone the night Vanessa arrived. Community response began to take form, public sympathy for the child, and an undercurrent of outrage when rumors of the fiancé's possible involvement began to surface. The household divided. Some insisted on Vanessa's innocence. Others recounted moments when she had been controlling or suspiciously present at odd hours. The press began to run headlines, and the names of everyone in the staff list were cross-checked by amateur sleuths online. The atmosphere in the mansion thickened into a fog of fear and accusation. At the heart of the inquiry came a moment when evidence seemed to be planted to mislead. A vial labeled as prescribed sedation was found in a trash bin near the upstairs study, but forensic analysis suggested the label had been affixed after the bottle had been opened. The scene set a fire of suspicion that someone was trying to push blame. In this tense stretch, Maria began to look for anything that did not fit the story she had been told all those years about the family. She searched through drawers she had never been permitted to open, reading letters and finding notes with Vanessa's handwriting, arranging meetings and insisting on secrecy. She took photographs on her old phone because she suspected a narrative was being curated. One afternoon, she confronted Henry in the pantry. "Have you been keeping any keys hidden?" she asked, hands clasped so tight her nails left crescent marks. "I keep inventory for the house," Henry replied, the tremor in his voice impossible to disguise. "Who replaced the lock on the west storage room?" Maria demanded. "It was ordered by Vanessa," he said. The backstory that unfurled during this investigation revealed that Vanessa had a past that few in town knew she had. A series of online articles and archived court notices from another city detailed her role as the manager of estates where sudden deaths had occurred under unclear circumstances. She had been involved in a complex web of relationships with wealthy men, and her fingerprints on documents suggested she had moved quickly to secure assets soon after tragedies. In interviews with an investigative journalist, Maria discovered that Vanessa had once been accused of coercive control against a former partner, and that in one instance a child was placed into protective services after a neighbor overheard a violent argument. This history did not prove guilt in the Lockwood case, but it painted a pattern of manipulative behavior and an unsettling willingness to control narratives for personal gain. 3 moments of tension shaped the public arc, and each demanded detail to capture their gravity. The first was the discovery itself, an hour of frantic rescue described earlier, which left the household hushed and the child clinging to life under hospital lights. Maria remembered the cold of the crate, the damp smell, and the way the boy's chest rose and fell like a small bell, and how those breaths tied the staff together in an unplanned alliance. In the second moment, a planted bottle and a hurriedly created timeline threatened to steer the investigation away from the real questions. The revelation that labels had been attached after the fact led to a midnight meeting in a cramped utilitarian room at the police station, where Detective Hayes pored over security footage and compared timestamps until a faint image of Vanessa near the rubbish bin at 1 minute past midnight appeared. That image set off a chain of interviews and denials, the housemates splitting into factions and clamps of grief turning into accusations. The third tense rupture came during a public confrontation in the hospital corridor, where the boy, who had regained strength, sat in a wheelchair and, in a voice that trembled but carried, named a face he had seen in the garden. It was a small whisper that rippled like thunder. "It was her," he said, pointing. The child had been coached gently by nurses to speak. The truth and his statement prompted immediate action from the detectives. They moved with purpose, gathering the staff, securing phones, and obtaining warrants. And the household that had once been a map of privilege suddenly contained a legal perimeter. The investigation deepened with technical work and archival research. Forensic experts ran toxicology screens that pinpointed a benzodiazepine derivative in the child's bloodstream, consistent with a sedative that can be crushed and dissolved. The laboratory took careful notes, and the forensic expert Morales explained the process in measured terms. A 300-word explanation of how plasma and tissue samples were compared under chromatography and mass spectrometry, and how even minute traces build a chain of evidence. He said that patterns of degradation in the compound suggested it had been administered at least 3 hours before discovery, and that packaging remnants found in a trash bin could be matched to fingerprints if the prints still existed. Detective Hayes built a timeline using phone records, traffic cameras, and witness statements. He stitched together the movements of Vanessa, Mr. Lockwood, Maria, and the staff, and identified a period when a delivery van had obscured a security camera angle. Maria spent nights cross-referencing notes, and a sympathetic neighbor named Gloria produced receipts showing that Vanessa had made a late-night pharmacy run. The press began to dig into Vanessa's past and found the archived articles that suggested a pattern in her life of inserting herself into vulnerable households and then moving quickly to formalize relationships in ways that isolated other caretakers. By now, the household dynamics had frayed, with several staff members, including the gardener Anthony and the nanny Claire, stepping forward to say what they had seen. Raoul, the chauffeur, provided an alibi for a period, but his watch had minutes missing he couldn't explain. The police obtained a warrant to search Vanessa's room, and in a locked jewelry box they found a small ribbon that matched a toy ribbon found in the crate. Confronted with this evidence, she changed her story repeatedly, claiming theft, claiming the ribbon was a keepsake from a niece. In custody, she was polite but stone-like, her eyes revealing nothing. Prosecutors convened, and the weight of physical evidence, chemical analysis, and witness testimony was assembled into a case file. The confrontation that led to the arrest was cinematic in its ordinary horror. It happened in a hospital corridor where sunlight pooled on linoleum and where a small crowd had gathered for an update. Vanessa stood flanked by a lawyer, her hands folded, though her fingers trembled. Detective Hayes presented the sequence of findings, the lab results, the security frames, and the recovered ribbon. "We have probable cause to detain you for questioning," he said. Vanessa attempted to interrupt. "This is ridiculous. You have no proof," she said, voice rising. "We have proof," the detective replied calmly, sliding a photograph across the table showing Vanessa near the west hedge on the night in question. Vanessa laughed once. A brittle sound then went silent when the child Oliver looked up and squeezed Maria's hand, then spoke with a clarity that cut the room. "She put me in the box," he said. The nurse steadied him, and Maria felt the air going thin with truth. The lawyer demanded a recess, and Vanessa's face crumpled in a way that briefly revealed raw fear. In the exchange that followed, Maria spoke plainly to the court, of media, and to the room of staff and family, and said, "I dug for a rusted ornament and found a child who needed help. I did not look for credit. I did what any person would do." The charge was not only about the physical act, it was about motive and access, and the prosecution worked to show that Vanessa had both opportunity and a pattern. Under questioning, Vanessa accused others of planting evidence and attempted to paint Maria as an opportunist, a claim met with outraged denial. The arrest was carried out with restraint. Officers placed Vanessa in handcuffs while her lawyer argued for release on bail. The household watched the van take her away, and the mansion felt suddenly like an empty theater after the performance ended. Months passed in phases, recovery hearings, and a trial that moved like a tide between public empathy and legal technicality. Oliver recovered physically, though he remained fragile in dream and memory. Mr. Lockwood spoke in an interview months later with a voice that had the husk of remorse and responsibility and said, "No amount of money can buy the peace that was lost." The trial became a focal point for debates about power, privilege, and the vulnerability of those who serve in private homes. Witnesses like Anthony, Claire, Henry, and Raul testified about small things that formed a mosaic of access and motive. The forensic expert Morales took the stand and calmly explained chromatography results to the jury. The doctor described the child's medical condition, and the detective laid out the timeline. Vanessa's defense tried to cast doubt on chain of custody and to suggest that obsession and jealousies among staff had created a narrative of guilt. The prosecution countered with physical correspondence, invoices, and a final forensic link tying the sedative traces to a prescription that Vanessa had falsified under an alias. The jury deliberated for hours that felt like a lifetime to those who had waited. When the verdict came in, the courtroom held its breath. The jury found Vanessa guilty on charges of attempted murder and child endangerment. The sentence that followed included prison time, restitution, and a court order that would keep her away from the Lockwood family. Months later, the mansion began to breathe again in small measures. Flowers were planted where the box had been found, and the garden took on a quiet new life, as if the land itself were attempting to heal. Maria returned to work, though her steps were slower and more careful. The employer offered public commendation and a private bonus, but she accepted neither graciously, preferring to keep the tranquility of cooking and ironing and the small routines that had always steadied her. The legal system did what it could to bring justice, and the trial's outcome gave a kind of closure, though scars remained. The community rallied around Oliver, sending cards and toys and quietly donating to medical bills. Detective Hayes received a commendation for thoroughness from the police station, yet he would later say in an interview that it was the courage of ordinary people like Maria and Anthony who made the difference. In the months that followed, Mr. Lockwood established a trust for Oliver and instituted stricter hiring practices for the household, installing logs and a transparent rotation of duties. He insisted on annual counseling for the children and a fund for the staff, so that no one felt trapped by economic necessity into staying silent. The epilogue of this case showed that small acts of bravery ripple outward. Maria was invited to a local community ceremony where she was recognized for her quick thinking and moral clarity, and she stood with her hands folded and the sting of new attention in her eyes. Jamie and Oliver learned to laugh in the garden again, though sometimes Oliver would pause and trace the place in the ground where the box had been buried. The town's newspapers ran pieces about accountability and about how power can corrode compassion when left unchecked. Months into the aftermath, the judge issued a final statement that emphasized the community's role in both protecting the vulnerable and in demanding justice. If this story made your chest tighten, you are not alone. Many felt the same knot of anger and relief as each new chapter arrived. Tell us what you think would have happened if Maria had not acted. Did she do the right thing by digging alone, or should she have called for backup first? Type A for yes, B for no, and tell us the city you are watching from in the comments so we can share different perspectives in a future follow-up. Your comments help build a community that cares about these stories and often provide leads others might have missed. The most thoughtful responses will be highlighted in an upcoming video, and together we can keep attention on accountability for those who have been silenced. Now, let us move back to the final moments in court and the wrenching testimony that sealed a verdict. In the end, the narrative of the Lockwood household changed from one of unchallenged wealth and privacy to a public lesson about vigilance and courage. Maria went from invisible housekeeper to vital witness, and the city spoke her name with respect rather than rumor. Justice had required time, evidence, and the willingness of ordinary people to speak up and stand firm. The family altered their routines, the staff received protections, and the community watched as a trial reminded everyone that secrets buried in private gardens can ruin lives or restore them, depending on whether someone chooses to dig. If this account moved you, subscribe to follow more investigations like this. Share the video and keep the conversation alive. Where a child was once hidden and silenced, now there are flowers and a small bench with a plaque that reads simply, "For those who protect the small and speak for the voiceless."